Good morning. I'm Toby Graham, Director of the Hargret Rare Book and Manuscript Library and Deputy University Librarian. And on behalf of the Hargret Library and the University of Georgia Libraries, of which it is a part, we welcome each one of you to the 9th Annual Georgia Writers Hall of Fame induction ceremony. Today we celebrate the lives and the writings of Judith Ortiz Cofer and Philip Lee Williams, and we pay tribute to the literary heritage of our state by honoring posthumously Georgia Douglas Johnson and Walter White. They're among the 39 writers inducted since the University of Georgia Libraries began the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame in 2000. And the Hargret Library that administers the Hall of Fame is the leading rare book and manuscript repository on Georgia history and culture. It includes the Georgiana collection, which is the most complete assemblage in existence of materials written by Georgians and about Georgia. As a part of our manuscript collections, the Hargret holds more than 6 million original documents, including papers related to literary figures such as Margaret Mitchell, Erskine Caldwell, Tennessee Williams, Byron Herbert Reese, Cora Harris, Lillian Smith, Calder Willingham, Harry Crews, Michael Bishop, Francis Mays, and others. As you can imagine, we're very excited that we have a new Special Collections Library building under construction here at the University of Georgia. It will provide a new and much expanded home, a much needed home for the Hargret Library, as well as the Richard B. Russell Library for Political Research and Studies and the Walter J. Brown Media Archives and Peabody Awards collection. And we look forward to hosting the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame in future years at the new building. I need to express the library's deep gratitude to George and Nancy Montgomery, whose love of history and literature and their philanthropic spirit led them to make a $2 million gift to the libraries, half of which goes to support the construction of the new building, and the other half to create an endowment for the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame to ensure that looking forward, we're able to continue to recognize the literary talent of Georgia and Georgians. I'd like to thank the First Lady of our university, Mary Adams, for being with us today. Ms. Adams, right back here, thank you. And thank you for being a part of the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame since its inception. I'd like to recognize Dr. William Gray Potter, who is also back in that corner, who is the University Librarian and Associate Provost, and whose visionary leadership guides us with the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame and in all that we do at the UGA Libraries. And I'd like to acknowledge and thank the Hargret Library's Director Emeritus, Mary Ellen Brooks. Where are you, Mary Ellen? And Skip Hewlett, who cannot be here today, for their work in starting the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame about a decade ago and helping to sustain it in the years since. And I need to thank our Development Office personnel, Chantel Dunham, Leander Nessel, Debbie Dove, and Mackenzie Herring, who worked so hard in coordinating this event and for many other things on behalf of the libraries. The Georgia Writers Hall of Fame relies on a distinguished panel of judges to determine which authors are inducted, and I'll also take a moment to recognize them, so please stand as you're able as I call your name. Mary Adams, Dr. David Bottoms, okay, who was inducted last year, Peggy Gallus, hey, Peggy, Julie Hunt, Dr. John Ensko, Shell Knox, Nicole Mitchell, Dr. Potter, Dr. Hugh Rippersberg, and is Mr. Thomas here with us this afternoon? Sidney Samuel Thomas is one of our judges. Lisa White, Jane Wilson, Dr. Jamil Zinaldine. And we have a couple of other board members who are not in attendance, Dr. Coleman Barks, Dr. Stephen Corey, and June Bailey White. And finally, and most importantly, we'd like to extend a very warm welcome to our new inductees and their family and friends, Judith Ortiz Cofer and Philip Lee Williams. Also the friends of Georgia Douglas Johnson and the family of Walter White, including his daughter, Jane White Viazzi, who are very pleased to have with us from New York. And now I'll turn the program over to Dr. Ann Williams, Professor of English Emeritus at the University of Georgia, who will introduce Judith Kofer.
I'm honored and delighted to introduce my friend and colleague Judith Ortiz Kofer today. We first met around 1980 in the English department coffee room. Looking back over Judith's history at the University of Georgia, I see her career as paradigmatic of the women of our generation, both here at UGA and in academia at large. Her career has not been easy, but it is an inspiring example of what a talented, persistent, and incredibly energetic woman can accomplish despite the barriers that were built into the system. I remember, for instance, that after several years teaching as an instructor here, Judith had already published a great deal for someone at that stage of her career. She applied for, but was not offered, the department's tenure-track position in creative writing. She left us for a while. We heard that she had won an NEH fellowship in poetry and that she was published in a novel, The Lion of the Sun, the first novel published by the University of Georgia Press and nominated for the Pulitzer Prize. Fortunately, but ironically therefore, when the man who had been hired for the assistant professorship in creative writing failed to win tenure, the department had a second chance and this time wisely offered Judith the position. She was quickly promoted to the rank of associate professor. During my first semester as department head in 1996, I invited Judith to read at the annual Departmental Honors Day. I was consciously following the established tradition of inviting one of our creative writers to read from their work, and I knew that Judith had not been invited as yet. Only later did I realize just how appropriate this invitation was, for the essay she chose to read was called Taking the Macho, doubly resonant perhaps in a department now dealing with its first female head. Things were really changing. Thus, I was dismayed when the department recommended Judith's promotion to full professor. The process was not automatic. We had to appeal, and though we eventually won, it was sad to see the college promotion committee's inherent suspicion, a suspicion that I can only attribute to the fact that Judith was writing about topics that they themselves had never contemplated or perhaps ever conceived of as appropriate for a writer, especially the experiences of a young woman negotiating 2 languages and 2 cultures. This reluctance was particularly ironic since during the decade of the 1990s, Judith's writing had gained national and international recognition. My favorite anecdote from this period comes from Professor Hugh Kenner, who was almost undoubtedly the most distinguished literary critic ever in the Department of English. He dropped by one day to tell me that he and his wife, Mary Ann, had been visiting one of their daughters who was teaching in a Chicago high school. In meeting him, her students had been most impressed to realize that he was in the very same department as Judith Ortiz Kofer, whom they had been reading. Judith's awards for teaching and for writing are too numerous to list. First, however, I want to remark on her extraordinary generosity to students, both in the English department and across campus. Whether a class is taught by a TA or a full professor, whether it's a writing class, a history class, a literature class, or a women's studies class, she's always willing to visit, to read from her work, and to talk to students about her writing. Her undergraduate teaching was recognized by the UGA Honors Program in 2000, and this spring, one of her former graduate students, Lorraine Lopez, was nominated for the National Book Critics Circle Award in Fiction. Judith's research awards at UGA include the Albert Christianer Prize that recognizes outstanding work by a faculty member in the humanities. In 1999, she was appointed Franklin Professor of English and Creative Writing by the College of Arts and Sciences. And in 2006, she was named Regents Professor, the highest research award granted by the Georgia State System. In 1999, she was also awarded what is possibly the best perk available to university faculty worldwide, a month-long residency at the Rockefeller Foundation's Villa Serbelloni in Bellagio, Italy, on the banks of Lake Como. Highlights of Judith's literary awards include the O. Henry Prize for the Best Short Story of 1994 and an invitation from the Spanish government to give a series of readings in Spain. She was invited to read at the German universities of Tübingen, Erlangen, and Heidelberg. Her book for young adults, An Island Like You, Stories of the Barrio, was recognized by the American Award for Children and Young Adult Literature, by the American Library Association's Reforma Pura Belpre Medal, the Dorothy Canfield Awards list, and it also appeared on 5 other lists of distinguished books of the year. Her novel, The Meaning of Consuelo, published in 2003, won the Americas Prize, sponsored by the National Consortium of Latin American Studies, and Call Me Maria won honorable mention by the same organization, which honors, quote, U.S. published titles that authentically and engagingly portray Latin America, the Caribbean, or Latinos in the United States. Reading through this list, one might infer that Judith's writings are primarily interesting in their portrayal of Latina experience, but that would be a mistake. Her work comprises an extraordinary range of genres and audiences. She writes for adults, but for young people too. She writes poems and prose poems, stories, novels, memoirs, and autobiography. Her writing is sometimes torn between the oral and the written, between the cuentos she overheard as a child and the literary language she inherited from the English tradition she acquired through reading, the new world she discovered in the Paterson, New Jersey Public Library. Caught between 2 languages as she has been, Judith's writing shows extraordinary sensitivity to the power and concreteness of words. Indeed, one of the paradoxes she explores is the paradox of her own relationship to these 2 languages. Spanish, the language of home and family and childhood; English, the language for literature, for the public self, for her professional adulthood. Nor should one forget that she is experiencing these 2 worlds from the perspective of a girl and then a woman, which changes things still further. A good example of such a complication can be found in the O. Henry Prize-winning story, Nada. This word inevitably evokes the rather bloodless metaphysics of Hemingway's clean, well-lighted place. But Ortiz-Cofer shows us the concrete despair, the nada, felt by a mother who has lost her husband and her son, the latter a soldier in Vietnam. Another of Judith's works is an edited collection that allows us to hear a range of women writing about the perils and rewards of female authorship. Sleeping with One Eye Open, Women Writers and the Art of Survival, published in 1999. I suspect that her affinity for so many different genres lies in the reality that borders between genres can be as permeable as those between countries and languages. In the past several decades, literary critics have discussed the role of the other in our literary imagination. Cultural others are most typically foreign and female, or imagined as such. But when Judith Ortiz-Cofer writes from the perspective of the other, as she often does, she shows us that this binary structure is not so absolute or so powerful as some have assumed. If one is oneself the other, both to herself and others, then home is a foreign country, and a foreign country is home. Spanish, the mother's tongue, becomes a strange language, and the father tongue, English, the language of power, becomes a home within which she can write. As one reviewer of the Latin Deli remarked, quote, Judith Ortiz-Cofer's work touches on human concerns that speak to none other than all of us. Judith has told me about a book she's working on now, tentatively called Peach Pit Corazon, a Georgia Reader. She mentions in her description of this project that Georgia is a state she finally calls home. Thus, I hope that she will feel very much at home in the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame, where she so clearly belongs. Thank you.
First, I'll just say that so many of those opportunities that Anne mentioned came to me because of Anne and other mentors that I had at the University of Georgia. But I just want to thank her with all my heart for the work that she did to help me get to this point. I will now speak words that may never have been spoken quite like this before at the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame induction. Muchas gracias. Gracias for making su casa mi casa. It's a great honor to be inducted into the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame, to have my name appear alongside writers such as Flannery O'Connor, Carson McCullers, Martin Luther King Jr., and so many others whose work shaped my life and spurred my imagination. My gratitude goes to all of you in my UGA community who have supported and rewarded my work by allowing me to do what I must do and love to do, write and teach. To Doctors Bill Potter and Toby Graham, and the wonderful staff of the University of Georgia Libraries, to Mrs. Adams and the panel of judges, thank you for making this important day in my life possible. There are too many names to mention, but a few names have to be spoken, for they mentored, guided, supported me in my writing and teaching. Anne, Betty Jean, Hugh, Nicole, and Catherine. There is no time to tell the story now, but if you run into Dr. Betty Jean Craig, ask her what she did to me relentlessly to make sure I finished my first novel. In a conspiracy with my husband, John, who typed every page on a typewriter numerous times to make sure that I did not give up. I'm grateful for the presence of two of our Jefferson County friends where we have our farm, my husband's esteemed colleagues, Dr. Molly Howard and Dr. Donnie Hodges. I dedicate this unique moment to my family, John, Tanya, Dory, and my brilliant grandson, Elias John Rudifer, age 2. Also grandson to Betsy and Emil Rudifer, present here today. And to those not present, my parents, who dragged me to Georgia in full adolescent rebellion many years ago. I wish they could see me today, so much better behaved, as I find myself at home in Georgia. My journey to this place and to this day has been circuitous. I have journeyed across 3 cultures and 3 languages, Puerto Rico, New Jersey, Georgia, have had to learn Spanish, New Jerseyan English, and Southern English. As young teenagers, my brother and I resisted the move from inner city Patterson, New Jersey to gorgeous Augusta, Georgia. All parental arguments were invalidated by my teenage anguish over leaving the familiar. More fresh air and green grass in Georgia? I enjoyed the fortifying city smells of exhaust and factory smoke. I liked cement. Did not give a hoot about magnolias. I had seen the film Gone with the Wind, and my only response had been, at least Scarlett is not a blonde. No, I would not go gently due south. My frustrated father packed the car with a final, it's not as if we're taking you to Mars, and we drove south through the night. My first sight, as car sick, I leaned over the window that first morning in Georgia, was the Martian landscape of my future home. Red clay. In an early essay, I described the shock of my Georgia landing. I'll read you a few lines from Advanced Biology, which is an essay about the successful relocation of adolescent anxieties from New Jersey to Georgia. For me, Georgia was a shock to the senses, like moving from one planet to another, where Patterson had concrete to walk on and gray skies, bitter winters, and a smorgasbord of an ethnic population. Georgia was red like Mars, and Augusta was green, exploding in colors and more gardens of azaleas and dogwood and magnolia trees, more vegetation than I imagined was possible anywhere not tropical like Puerto Rico. People seemed to come in 2 basic colors, black and blonde. And I could barely understand my teachers when they talked in a slowed-down version of English, like one of those old 78-speed recordings played at 33. Language is the only homeland, said Nobel laureate in exile, Czesław Miłosz. My book of poems is called A Love Story Beginning in Spanish. It's a story about language. My love story beginning in Spanish has been about a love of language and books. But I came to English the hard way, and maybe that is why my love for my adopted language is so strong. Finding my voice in English was the crucial first step I had to take to get to this day. From silence to voice. After our move from Puerto Rico to Paterson, New Jersey, early in my American life, I discovered the power of language to transform my reality, to shape my future. My reality then was intrinsically connected to Spanish and to my native culture, which was the small but familiar and safe world our parents could offer us within the confines of our home and the boundaries of our barrio. When I began to master the English language, the language of our survival, I expanded my borders. I added new dimensions to my reality, new options to my future. Little by little, I reinvented myself as a new American, one who could travel between languages and cultures, adding rather than subtracting from each, taking what I needed for my self-empowerment. Before I had English, I was two people at the same time, the silent, unseen girl in the back of the class. And then when I came home, my family spokesperson and their interpreter. My mother was fearless in Spanish, but inhibited in English. She claimed that when she spoke in English, her thick accent and hesitations made her sound ignorant. So she had me speak for her. My basic vocabulary was good enough to get us through our daily struggles, but it was a national crisis that transformed me into an English speaker. My poem, called A Theory of Chaos, attempts to capture in words the phenomenon I experienced on that day in October of 1962, the day when language became a matter of survival. My father was in the US Navy and away on a dangerous mission. His ship was part of the embargo President Kennedy had imposed on Cuba during the missile crisis. We had not heard from him in months. Then my mother got sick. My mother's fever peaked and she asked me to call a doctor. He agreed to call in a prescription. His nurse spelled the difficult Latin names for me, and I wrote them in my notebook. When I hung up, I was trembling. I could not pronounce the words I had written down. I told my mother that I could not do it. I could not speak English, but she said, "I know you can do this, hija. I will say a prayer to your ángel de la guardia, and he will accompany you." Something happened to me that day on my way to get help for my sick mother. I was afraid yet completely focused on my mission. I started practicing words that I didn't even know I had in my brain and putting sentences together. I heard myself speaking these words in English. In my poem, written decades later, I tried to articulate the mystery of language acquisition. I now know that what happened was a natural process. For months, I had been subconsciously absorbing English, preparing to put sounds into words and words into sentences, just as babies do. Then the crisis of my father's absence and my mother's illness focused my need for language. I could speak because I needed to speak, and also because I was ready to speak my language of survival. And this is how I arrived at my theory of chaos. I credit the idea for my poem to my daughter, Tanya, who is a mathematician. We often talk about how mathematics and poetry use similar techniques to arrive at the truth, such as metaphor and analogy. She gave me an article on chaos theory, which is too complicated for me to understand without a background in physics and math, but I know that it tries to explain how a series of small occurrences can lead to a natural phenomenon such as El Niño or a tsunami after the introduction of that mysterious force called the strange attractor. The question in chaos theory that prompted my poem is called the butterfly effect, and it goes something like this. Does the flap of a butterfly's wings in Brazil set off a tornado in Texas? I use this elegant image from the scientific paper in my poem to convey how I felt that day when I made English mine, when I knew I had the power to make words work for me. It was as if a million pieces of information had come together inside my head, or a million butterflies had lifted their tiny wings and I found my voice. A Theory of Chaos, October 1962. The epigraph is from Thomas Wolfe. Quote, "Each moment is the fruit of 40,000 years. The minute-winning days like flies buzz home to death, and every moment is a window on all time," unquote. I was just 10 and far away from all I had known when I was sent to find help for my sick mother. Ships and warplanes were gathering around Cuba, and my father was in one of them. Silenced by national security, dead or alive, we did not know. I could not speak English and so was totally alone. Words in the new language were simmering in my head like bees trying to communicate salvation through dance. My life was chaos, shaped by chance, biology, and either el destino or circumstance. I did not know or care then that I carried the coded message to make language from pure need. But then, as I entered the too bright drugstore, alien as a spaceship, sudden as Ezekiel's wheel, mysterious as the Annunciation, I could understand the speech of people. I could read the labels and raised my head up to hear the voice over the loudspeaker. All was clear and fell into place, even the blinding light. It had taken 10 minutes of absolute dread, of nearly drowning in my own chemicals, and maybe of synapses folding into dams and bridges, a million butterflies lifting their minuscule wings as one gale winds over Iceland. And the strange attractor this time, dressed in aqua in pink robes and feathers, called down by my mother from fevered dreams of guardian angels to aid me. Given the gift of tongues, my heart and brain synchronized their wing beats or cranked the secret engine just long enough to allow one small frightened girl to fly a little, to hover low over the chaos and just above where meaning begins. And then other national crises and personal crises led to the move that in turn has led to this day. In 1968, America went wild. Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination ignited riots in cities across the nation. The violence in Newark came too close to our home. My parents spent a great deal of time arguing as to where we should move. My mother wanted us to return to her mother's house in Puerto Rico. Father did not want us to interrupt our education in English. He had come up with a, quote, temporary solution. We would move to Augusta, Georgia for a year or two until things calmed down in Patterson. His two brothers were stationed in Fort Gordon with the Army, and we had teenage cousins there. My brother, then 12, and I 15, threw fits. We did not want to move away. Not that we loved our limited lives in Patterson, but by then both Puerto Rico and Augusta sounded like foreign lands to us. We left our familiar war zone of the inner city just before the summer of love and headed south toward a new American life we could have never imagined. Am I home at last? Tennessee Williams said, "Time is the longest distance between two places." I'm interested in the intersection of time, place, and identity in writing. That is, the moment when place has been absorbed by self to become the mind's identifiable home place. When does the imagination take root in a particular landscape? I'm interested in the idea of locale as it triggers the imagination. In my work, I have explored my obsessions by setting poems, essays, and stories in places I knew best in my early life, Puerto Rico and Patterson. I have always felt that trying to write about the present moment would result in a transcription, a courtroom record, rather than in art. And besides recollections of a world that no longer exists, recreations from memory combined with research and imagination have come to me clearly and without the tensions inherent in reportage. I have been true to my personal vision with few witnesses to contradict me. I have written about my childhood and young adulthood in Puerto Rico and New Jersey with confidence, with the confidence of the historian and the archaeologist reconstructing Rome and recreating the lives of the Romans from artifacts and from whatever records survive time. Tennessee Williams may have understood the reluctance of some writers to use the present moment. He said, quote, "Life is all memory, except for the one present moment that goes by you so quick you hardly catch it coming." But something has changed in recent years. I have begun to feel strongly that it is time to write about my time in the South, specifically in Georgia. I have gained an awareness of having reached a new juncture in time and place. Does this feeling indicate that I'm close to home? Beauty is truth, truth beauty, that is all you know on earth and all you need to know. John Keats, Ode to an Grecian Urn. Perhaps not all John Keats, but it's a start. He died very young. I'll end with the most important thing I have learned on my journey towards becoming a Puerto Rican American Georgia writer. Home is where the people you love need and want you to be, and where you can do the work of your life. And my family is and has been at home in Georgia. And perhaps I am home at last in Georgia. In any case, Georgia is on my mind. And, and my love story beginning in Spanish is continuing in English. I believe I'm ready to combine my realities and attempt to make its disparate parts coalesce in a new vision for my future work. I'd like to end with a poem that I hope conveys my idea of an inclusive common ground. This is a poem that does not attempt to have my cultures melt in a pot, but rather to have them naturally meld, come together organically and naturally. To Understand El Azul is a poem that could not have been written if I had not met John Cofer when we were both 18. He's a Southern guy. And learned through him that it is possible, indeed necessary, to try to appreciate a landscape through the eyes of the other. By his example, I learned how to think of red clay as not only beautiful, but as a yielding element, mysterious as the ocean depths. The Georgia earth can be plumbed for its history in arrowheads and artifacts, can be used to make numerous useful things. It can feed you most abundantly, and if you're inclined to do so, you can harvest worms for fishing. I have only a theoretical knowledge of this last particular gift of the land. This poem may not have been written if I had not received a commission from UGA VIPs to write a poem for the freshman convocation one year. This would have to be a poem to celebrate the diversity of our student population in some way. Finding a way was my task. I had never written a poem by request, and I was in a panic. I did not know how to begin until I got help from the two people in my life who loved their very different native lands with equal passion, my husband and my mother. My mother is featured in many of my poems and stories. She is my favorite devil's advocate and joyful opponent. That summer of my commissioned poem, I went to visit her in Puerto Rico, and she did the usual, sat across from me at the table watching me agonize over a way to convey truth and beauty from a multicultural perspective. She suggested we go for a ride to refrescar la vista, an idiomatic phrase transliterated. It means roughly to refresh your vision. How right. She took me to a hill where we could see the ocean meeting the sky. The many hues of blue transfixed me. Ese azul, I said, awestruck. That blue. Mi cielo, mi mar, she declared. My sky, my ocean. To her, the most beautiful sight in the world. I came back to our farm in Jefferson County with half the vision I needed for my UGA poem. It was a time between seasons in Georgia, cool mornings, warm days, and from our porch, John pointed out his favorite sight, the early morning mist rising over the pond, and the ghostly figure of our resident blue heron, a mysterious presence who arrives at our small body of water to rest from his journeys, then flies off again, not to be seen again for months. John's vision of beauty combined with my mother's gave me this poem, which I hope dramatizes the only thing I know about coming together in this interesting, diverse, and complicated world we live in, and that is that one has to learn to find beauty and try to recognize truth through the eyes of the other. Beauty and truth as a reciprocal proposition. That is all I know. It may not be all I need to know, but I still have a little time left to discover the rest. I'll end with To Understand El Azul. We dream in the language we all understand, in the tongue that preceded alphabet and word. Each time we claim beauty from the world, we approximate its secret grammar, its silent syntax, draw nearer to the Rosetta Stone for dismantling Babel. If I say El Azul, you may not see the color of mi cielo, mi mar. Look once upon my sky, my sea, and you will know precisely what El Azul means to me. Begin with this, the cool kiss of a September morning in Georgia, the bell-shaped currents of air changing in the sky, the sad ghosts of smoke clinging to a cleared field, and the way days will taste different in your mouth each week of the season. Sábado, Saturday is strawberry. Martes, Tuesday is bitter chocolate to me. Do you know what I mean? Still, everything we dream circles back. Imagine the bird that returns home every night with news of a miraculous world just beyond your private horizon. To understand its message, first you must decipher its dialect of distance, its idiom of dance. Look for clues in its arching descent, in the way it resists gravity. Above all, you have to learn why it aims each day towards the boundless azul. Thank you.
Thanks, Christian. Thank you so much. It was wonderful. Dr. Judith L. Stevens-Lorenz, Emeritus Professor of Humanities and Theater at Penn State University in the Schuylkill campus, will introduce our first posthumous inductee, Georgia Douglas Johnson. Dr. Stevens-Lorenz has written extensively about Georgia Johnson and wrote the introduction on an anthology of Johnson's plays. And accepting the award on behalf of Georgia Johnson is Galen Gatewood Josho, Director of Alumni Relations at Clark Atlanta University, of which Georgia Johnson is an alumnus. Dr. Stevens-Lorenz. Thank you.
Thank you. It's true, Georgia Douglas Johnson has no living relatives. So I'm very honored to participate in this ceremony today. And please excuse me, I have somewhat of a cold, so I hope everybody can hear me. Can everyone hear me? Back okay? Georgia Douglas Johnson was a multi-talented writer. She wrote poems, plays, short stories, newspaper columns, and music. And I think that the honor she is receiving today of being inducted into the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame would bring her great pleasure and great satisfaction. Although she lived most of her life in Washington, D.C., she was born in Atlanta, Georgia. She always considered Georgia her home state and Atlanta her native city. She was born in 1877. She was very proud of her mixed-race ancestry. Her father was of black and white ancestry, and her mother was of black and Native American ancestry. She graduated from Atlanta University's Normal School. She taught in Atlanta, Georgia, and in Marietta, Georgia. But in 1910, she moved with her husband and 2 young sons to Washington, D.C., and she was to remain there for the rest of her life. But in Washington, D.C., she grew and developed as a writer. And by that, I mean she became a very dedicated writer, and she wrote every day. And a friend of hers, Alice Dunbar Nelson, who was a great friend of Georgia Douglas Johnson's, and was also a writer, said that the dining room table in Johnson's home was routinely cluttered with papers, a typewriter, and literary journals, much to her husband's disapproval. And her husband believed that a woman should have her house and her children and be satisfied with that. But Johnson never let his disapproval interfere with her writing. In fact, she dedicated her first 2 volumes of poetry to him. So she had a wonderful spirit. And she died in 1966, is buried outside of the city in Washington, D.C. in Lincoln Cemetery. And the year before she died, in 1965, Atlanta University awarded her an honorary Doctor of Literature degree and recognized her as, quote, a credit to her native city, her alma mater, her race, and humanity. So in looking back over her work this morning, I just briefly want to focus on her poetry, her plays, and the literary salon that she held in her home. She was known as the lady poet of the Harlem Renaissance, and the Harlem Renaissance, as many of you know, was that flowering of art and literature of African Americans who lived in generally the 1920s and 1930s. She was known as the lady poet of the Harlem Renaissance, or also called the New Negro Renaissance, because she was the most anthologized poet of that era. She wrote lyrical poetry, which many people labeled as genteel poetry or polite poetry. And in addition to her work appearing in anthologies, she published 4 books of her own poetry. She focused on themes such as love, dreams, passion, the passing of youth, the seeking of wisdom in old age. And she also addressed the hopes and dreams of women in her era and the gendered constraints placed upon their lives. And probably her most famous poem is called The Heart of a Woman. And her first book was published in 1918, and it's called The Heart of a Woman and Other Poems. So I'm going to read The Heart of a Woman this morning. The heart of a woman goes forth with the dawn, as a lone bird soft winging so restlessly on. Afar o'er life's turrets and vales does it roam. In the wake of those echoes, the heart calls home. The heart of a woman falls back with the night and enters some alien cage in its plight and tries to forget it has dreamed of the stars while it breaks, breaks, breaks on the sheltering bars. Her next volume of poems was entitled Bronze, and she focused in this work more on the struggles of Black women. And they're just a sampling of one called Guardianship. She's addressing a Black mother holding her child upon her lap. Guardianship. That dusky child upon your knee is breath of God's eternity. Direct his vision to the height. Let not obscure his royal right. And not only was she a prolific poet, but she inspired others to write, especially young Black writers. She encouraged them to find strength within themselves and take pride of their work. Cedric Dover wrote, "We found in her the blood and bone we needed to fight the evangelists of colored inferiority and their converts within our own groups." Her 2 other books of poetry were The Autumn Love Cycle, which was written in 1928, and Share My World, which was written closer to her death in 1962. And most recently, her poems have been collected, and other works of hers have been collected and published under the title of Selected Works of Georgia Douglas Johnson, and that was edited by Claudia Tate, and it was published in 1996. And since universities have started offering courses in Black studies and women's studies, Georgia Douglas Johnson has received a lot more scholarly attention, I'm happy to say. In addition to her poetry, she wrote 28 plays. Most of these are lost, unfortunately. We have 11 of them, which I edited a volume of in 2006. She mostly wrote in the one-act form. She was writing for the Little Theater Movement, which was a theater movement taking place at the same time as the Harlem Renaissance in the 20s and 30s. And she was writing for amateur venues and brief plays that could be put on in places such as the YMCA, churches, halls, lodges. These were the type of venues she was writing for. But her plays were published in, or produced in Washington, D.C., New York, and Chicago. Also, at that time, the Black-sponsored journals, Crisis and Opportunity. Crisis was sponsored by the NAACP, and Opportunity sponsored by the Urban League. They were holding one-act play contests for the best one-act play on Black life, and Johnson entered her plays in these contests. In 1927, She won second prize for her play Blue Blood, which was set in Florida and deals with white men's exploitation of black women. It was set in Georgia after the Civil War. And in the next year, 1927, her play Plumes won first prize in the Opportunity Contest, and that deals with a black family living in poverty in the rural South. She confronted racial issues of her time more directly in her plays than she did in her poetry. For example, 6 of her plays are anti-lynching plays. She wrote against the racial violence of lynching, which many of you know was the murder of African Americans with no repercussion for the murderers. And she wrote against this brutal act of racial violence, and she sent her plays to the NAACP. She knew Walter White, who is one of our other inductees of today, and she offered her plays for their use in their anti-lynching campaign. And she told Walter White she admired him very much for being in the front lines of fire and in leading the NAACP's fight against lynching. 2 of those plays, a bill to be passed and still they paused, were about the wrangling in Congress of back and forth, never being able to pass an anti-lynching bill. So the wrangling in Congress is all very familiar to us still today. And she was very frustrated with that. And our Congress never did pass an anti-lynching bill. She's a key figure in theater history because she's the most prolific playwright of anti-lynching drama. Anti-lynching drama was written by both men and women, black and white, but no one wrote as many as she did. And she's the leading figure in this genre. Also, she was writing in the 1920s, making her a pioneer in African American theater. She was among the earliest playwrights to create characters representing black, rural, Southern women and to place them at the center of the play. And she also was the first, one of the first playwrights to put the black female blues singer on the stage. So her plays form an important link between the playwrights writing for amateur venues in the 1920s and the more commercially successful plays of Alice Childress and Lorraine Hansberry in the 1950s. In 1955, she was still seeking a way to get her play Brotherhood produced. She wanted to get it produced on TV because television was the new technology at that time, and she was always seeking a wider audience for her plays and new production venues. And finally, I just want to mention her literary salon. She opened her home to artists and writers to come to her house, talk about their works in progress, read to each other from their works. Langston Hughes was a regular attender, and he wrote that he remembers Johnson's home as a place where, quote, artists would come to eat Mrs. Johnson's cake and drink her wine and talk poetry, books, and plays. She was writing a book about her literary salon, and unfortunately that manuscript is lost. But that would be wonderful if a young scholar would ever uncover that manuscript someday. It would be a wonderful book to read. Very well-known writers attended and not so well-known writers, but she made everyone feel welcome. The last thing I want to mention is that everybody that has carried out research on Georgia Douglas Johnson they have talked about her undying optimism. She felt the greatest mistake was to give up. And so she kept trying throughout her life, even though it was hard for her to find publishers and support for her writing. After the 20s and 30s, she never gave up. And she applied to foundations so she could have some support for her writing. She applied to many publishers, but she received many rejections. But she wrote to a friend in the 1950s, after many rejections from publishers and foundations, I still have high hopes, and I am looking with my heart's bright eyes to that bright tomorrow. And I think today would be one of those bright tomorrows that she always believed would come. Thank you.
To the members and guests of the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame 9th Annual Ceremony, to each 2009 distinguished inductee and their family members, good morning. It is with esteemed pleasure as the Director of Alumni Relations, I stand before you in honor and memory of Georgia Douglas Johnson. Encompassing Clark Atlanta University's dual mottos of culture for service and I'll find a way or make one, speaks for the life and career of alumna Georgia Douglas Johnson. Representing the class of 1896 of Atlanta University's Normal School, where emphasis was placed on the science of teaching and the study of music, she was a student during the time of major transformation at the university. Furthermore, during her matriculation, she must have been influenced by the distinguished scholar, Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, who served on the faculty. For Dr. Du Bois penned the foreword for her second published book entitled Bronze, a Book of Verse. Though a living relative could not stand in her honor or memory on this day, we at Clark Atlanta University stand as a catalyst, and polisher of her many skills. Yes, she was a musician, poet, playwright, and fiction writer, and moreover, an intellectual and mentor. We are her collegiate family with arms that stretch across the United States and the world, and will continue to cherish her as a trailblazer and one of the most well-known African-American women writers of the 1900s who pioneered the Harlem Renaissance. Also, we will relish this honor of her induction into the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame within the archives of our university. On behalf of our president, Carlton E. Brown, alumni, faculty, staff, and students of Clark Atlanta University, and in respect to Georgia Douglas Johnson's alma mater, Atlanta University, one of our parent institutions, we thank you for honoring one of our daughters.
Introducing our second posthumous inductee, Walter White, is Dr. John Insko, author and professor of history at the University of Georgia, and accepting on behalf of Walter White is his daughter, Jane White. And before I turn the podium over to John, I just would mention about Ms. White. She's also she has another connection with the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame. Actually, she is a prominent and award-winning actress who made her leading lady debut in the lead character in Lillian Smith's Strange Fruit on Broadway. So that's another wonderful connection that you have. But Dr. Insko.
Thanks. Of the many eyewitness accounts we have of the Atlanta race riot of 1906, none is more chilling than that describing a 13-year-old black boy's confrontation with an angry white mob on the steps of his home. That young man was Walter White, who grew up to become the executive secretary of the NAACP and an influential civil rights activist. He began his 1948 autobiography, A Man Called White, with this incident in a chapter entitled, I Learn What I Am. White provided his own racial identification in the first sentences of his book. I am a Negro. My skin is white, my eyes are blue, my hair is blonde. The traits of my race are nowhere visible upon me. And if you all have your programs, you can look at his picture and see that that's indeed the case. He elaborated in explaining why he ultimately made the conscious choice to remain black. I am not white, he wrote. There is nothing within my mind and heart which tempts me to think that I am. Yet I realize acutely that the only characteristic that matters to either the white or the colored race, the appearance of whiteness, is mine. There's magic in a white skin. There is tragedy, loneliness, exile in a black skin. Why then do I insist that I am a Negro when nothing compels me to do so but myself? White credits a single incident as the answer to that question so often posed to him by others, either directly or indirectly. I know the night when in terror and bitterness of soul I discovered that I was set apart by the pigmentation of my skin, and the moment at which I decided that I would infinitely rather be what I was, rather than through taking advantage of the way of escape that was open to me, to be one of the race which had forced that decision upon me. That night was Sunday, September 13th, 1913, the second night of the Atlanta race riot. The day before, young White was caught downtown with his father, a postman who was making his rounds when the riot broke out on that fateful Saturday afternoon. From their wagon, they witnessed the savagery of the white mob as they pursued defenseless white victims through the streets and beat them to death, quote, to the accompaniment of savage shouting and cursing, and then moved on after new prey. Because of their light skin color, father and son made it safely home, but learned the next day that white hooligans were regrouping and planning to move into their neighborhood in order to, quote, clean out the niggers. White provided a harrowing account of his family's preparation for the onslaught to come. He and his father, armed with guns, waited on the front porch of their home, which they had been warned was to be a torch-carrying mob's first target, while his mothers and sisters hid in the back of the house. His father instructed him, "Son, don't shoot until the first man sets foot on the lawn, and then don't you miss." The mob indeed surged toward the house, but was quickly dispersed by a volley of shots from neighbors before the whites had to fire themselves. It was at that moment, Walter later wrote, that his epiphany came. As he put his gun aside, he found himself, quote, gripped by the knowledge of my identity, and in the depths of my soul I was vaguely aware that I was glad of it. I knew then who I was. I was a Negro, a human being with an invisible pigmentation which marked me as a person to be hunted, hanged, abused, discriminated against, kept in poverty and ignorance, in order that those whose skin was white would have readily at hand a proof of their superiority. He continued this extraordinary diatribe against the white race and all that it inflicted on other races. I was sick with loathing for the hatred which had flared before me that night and come so close to making me a killer. But I was glad I was not one of those who hated. I was glad I was not one of those whose story is in the history of the world a record of bloodshed, rape, and pillage. I was glad my mind and spirit were part of the races that had not fully awakened, and who therefore still had before them the opportunity to write a record of virtue as a memorandum to Armageddon. He concluded the first chapter of this book from the hindsight of the late 1940s, when he wrote, "It was all just a vague feeling then, inarticulate and melancholy, yet reassuring in the way that death and sleep are reassuring. And I have clung to it now for nearly half a century." Few life stories open as dramatically as does White's, and few black autobiographers have ever come to terms with their racial identities as suddenly or as surely as White claimed to have done in 1906. One of White's biographers called this passage the most compelling 8 pages White ever wrote, and it's easy to see why it would be hard to top, both in terms of the events it describes and the feelings it generated, but also in the great skill and passion evident in the writing itself. I've long taught a course here at UGA on Southern autobiography, and this is a book I assign regularly to my classes, and one that students find as compelling as anything that we read. I appreciate the UGA Press keeping this book in print and keeping it accessible to us for class. And I advise any of you or anyone interested in reading it, it is a great read and even more fun to read when you're not assigned it in class. Well, Walter White is one of those people like W.E.B. Du Bois, Martin Luther King Jr., Jimmy Carter, or Elias Boudinot, who we have inducted into the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame, but who were not first and foremost writers. They were instead activists, political and social leaders who in a variety of ways and on a variety of stages confronted the racial and class inequities and injustices of the American South. And yet their writings were integral to their causes and their careers. And by recognizing White today as a writer, we bring to light what was perhaps a lesser-known facet of his career, but then one that was closely tied to his lifelong quest for racial justice and civil rights. Walter White spent most of his career working for the NAACP and served as its executive secretary from 1929 to 1955. In the quarter century prior to the Supreme Court's 1954 Brown v. Board of Education decision, White was one of the most prominent African-American activists and spokesmen in this country. Upon his death in 1955, the New York Times eulogized him as, quote, the nearest approach to a national leader of American Negroes since Booker T. Washington. In 1917, the year after White graduated from Atlanta University, James Weldon Johnson, field secretary of the NAACP and himself an Atlanta University graduate, visited the city and met White. He was so impressed by his enthusiasm and political skills that he had him appointed as the assistant secretary of the NAACP. Over the next decade, White's primary responsibility was conducting undercover investigations of lynchings and race riots. Using his fair complexion to his advantage, White infiltrated lynch mobs and Klan rallies and often tricked individual members into giving them candid accounts that the NAACP would then use to expose and prosecute. During those years, White investigated 41 lynchings and 8 race riots. On more than one occasion, he narrowly escaped white supremacists who discovered his true identity. In 1929, he put those experiences and observations into a seminal book on the subject called Rope and Faggot, which remains an authoritative analysis of the extent and causes of Southern lynching. And he continued to draw on those reports from those years on for much of his literary output for many years to come, culminating, of course, in A Man Called White. Living in New York, White became an influential member of the Harlem Renaissance, and in that capacity he turned to fiction, producing 2 novels in the 1920s. The superior of the 2 is the first, entitled The Fire and the Flint. It, too, has been reprinted by UGA Press. They're drawn from White's experience in investigating lynchings. It tells the story of Kenneth Harper, a black physician in small-town South Georgia during the years after the First World War, who was murdered by the Ku Klux Klan when he helped local black sharecroppers organize to resist the exploitation they faced at the hand of white landholders. Sinclair Lewis declared that it, along with E.M. Forster's A Passage to India, were the 2 best novels published in 1924. And other critics declared it, quote, one of the most successful exposés of lynching in American fiction. Many feel that it was a major inspiration for Lee and Smith's first novel, Strange Fruit. So another connection there. White's second novel, Flight, published in 1926, features a light-skinned African-American heroine from Atlanta who moves to Harlem, seeks her fortune by disappearing into white society, but eventually returns once again to her own race to seek spiritual fulfillment. That novel is the first in which White provides a detailed account of the Atlanta race riot that in some ways foreshadows the description he would include much later in his memoir. In addition to his own fiction, White was central in other ways to the flowering of the Harlem Renaissance. He vigorously promoted the work of other artists, including writers Langston Hughes, Claude McKay, and as we've just heard, Georgia Douglas Johnson, the tenor Roland Hayes, a fellow Georgian, and singer and actor Paul Robeson. White eagerly vetted manuscripts, introduced writers to publishers, and brought stage and concert performers to the attention of the public. As essayist, autobiographer, novelist, and nonfiction writer, Walter White believed that creative writing might serve to uplift his race. In that role, as political man of letters, Walter White was, in the words of R. Baxter Miller here at UGA, quote, one of the most successful figures of the new Negro movement of the 1920s, and one whose influence is extended long afterwards, on into mid-century and through the Civil Rights Movement. This, then, is the literary activist, much of whose work, both fiction and nonfiction, remains as powerful, as poignant, and as persuasive now as it was when he produced it. And it is he that we honor today with induction into the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame. Thank you.
Hello. I am so moved by this, I don't know how to tell you. I'm so grateful. I prepared, well, actually, I kind of adjusted what I laughingly call my autobiography that I've been working on for many, many years and probably will never finish. But I've put into this a great deal of material that Dr. Insko already covered, so I'll hasten through that. But I knew Walter White. and I was terribly impressed with him. The man I called Daddy all his life, and still do as an old woman when I speak of him, was not much in evidence during my childhood. He always seemed to me to be going off somewhere in a hurry. The Harlem apartment with just me and my mother in it would assume familiar rhythms and a calm, quiet state over periods of days, but that would all change when he would suddenly reappear on a tsunami of energy. It was a phenomenon both exciting and alarming for a child under 5. An increase in disorder, in noise, in tension between parents, in electric light, and in unfamiliar attention to me. And there was talk. All of a sudden, so much talk in the air around me when he was home. He talked to my mother. He talked in my presence, at me, perhaps to me, whether I understood or not. He talked to the occasional guests at the apartment and on the expensive new telephone. Part of the food I grew up on was the fattening sound of words and language. My enduring love for them was due to my father. When he wasn't talking, he was often taking photographs, family pictures, usually out of doors in the small park across the street from our apartment building, where natural light helped a primitive Brownie camera to function. In the park, there was a lot of stand over there near the railing and stand still to me. Sometimes exasperation with my mother because her control over me was imperfect. But I had the impression that he liked us, liked having a little family to show off as any young man of substance should. But no more than a dog or a cat in a household did I understand what Daddy did when he was mysteriously away from us. Your father's busy didn't tell me much, nor would I have understood if it was explained. To me, cocooned as I was, bad things didn't happen between people. The world was a benign place. When my mother and I went out into the uptown streets, we moved among a palette of nutmeg-colored skins, pale white skins, coal black skins, our own complexions adding yet another variation to the mix, and there seemed to be goodwill, even from those white residents reluctant to yield up the great acres of Harlem space they inhabited, the vast old apartments, the European boulevards, the stores and markets they owned. Even from them, there was random kindness when we encountered them. A lollipop, a smile, a few neighborly words exchanged with my mother over the top of my head. Those people didn't live with us in the same buildings, true, or evidently socialize with us, or go to the same workplaces. But what I felt between us was not hostile or frightening. Of course, what I knew then about power had only to do with the exercise of my own and the strength of my lungs to get what I wanted. I was a spoiled and protected colored child. The wounds of racism were deferred, but not in my father's world. It seems likely that in all that great volume of talk washing over me, he was telling my mother about major deterrents or minuscule advances in the defensive work of the young NAACP they both knew, of his own narrow escape from a southern town when its white citizens discovered that an NAACP official was masquerading among them, not only as a businessman, but as a white man. He must have been boasting to her. Walter White boasted very well. But it turns out he was, without having told me about it, a published author now, too, and could have been gloating about the successful reviews that his first novel, The Fire in the Flint, had received in 1924. The story of a young colored doctor returning to his southern town to set up practice after his war service abroad, who is lynched for overstepping the local racial barriers. It was, in some historians' opinions, one of the books that ushered in the vibrant Harlem Renaissance. He said he wrote the book in 12 days at a New England cottage lent to him and my mother by one of the NAACP founders, and that is probably so. His energy was prodigious, and his dedication to a given goal matched it. You'd better just get out of the way. It is possible that Mary White Ovington lent us her house again when he wrote his 1926 novel, Flight. To this day, I can envision that little house, a pale wood-shingled structure set in a sort of gully close to the road, the 3 or so rooms in sequence as if they were railway cars, with high-placed windows facing the roadside and shedding lots of country light. I recall being prohibited by my mother day after day from running wildly through the cottage and yelling for the hell of it, because my father was concentrating over his portable typewriter, enveloped in a pulsing mist of cigarette smoke and irritable as a wasp. It could have been no vacation from the city for my poor mother, cooking and washing and restraining, even if it was in the country air. But when Daddy's first book was published, he inscribed it to My Egyptian Rose. Here is our first novel, and this, the very first copy off the press. To you, my dear, should go a very great part of whatever success it may haply achieve. Ever yours, Walter. New York City, 19 August 1924. Thank you.
And lastly, author in 2005, Georgia Writers Hall of Fame inductee Terry Kay will introduce Philip Lee Williams.
When this day is over and you return to your home, go to your computer, if you have one, and connect with a browser of your choice. And at the http://www.bar, type in Philip Lee Williams, one word, .com. There you will find bits and pieces, specks and flashes of a life of an accomplished man. I want you to do this because you might otherwise believe the words I am to offer are from the raving of a person obsessed with hyperbole. For I am here to praise Philip Lee Williams, shamelessly and gladly praise him. At the beginning of that website, you will see Philip's name, and beside it, these words: novelist, poet, essayist, composer. He might also have added screenwriter, artist, teacher, mentor, and he might have added this word, friend. It is that word, that friend word, that provides me this privilege of introducing him to you as a member of the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame. Phil Williams is my friend, has been for many, many years. And I need to say something up front about that. Phil's last book, The Campfire Boys, was dedicated to me. The words in the book read, "For Terry Kay, brother in art." I consider that dedication an honor on par with my own induction into this august body of writers. The day Phil told me about it, I wept. And of course, I am pleased to report to you that it is an extraordinary book, one of the most enchanting reading experiences I've had in years, and yes, I have read beyond the dedication page. My first memory of knowing Phil Williams goes back to 1986 and to a house in Atlanta's Grant Park that was being rented by my friend Frank Smith. We were having a party for some reason now lost to memory, and a number of us were out on the porch just talking. Pat Conroy was there, Frank, Bernie Shine, Cliff Grabart, Paul Darcy Bowles, maybe Paul Hemphill. We were talking about the Townsend Award, a literary honor named for our friend, the late Jim Townsend. It had been established in 1981 as an every other year event, with the first award going to Celestine Sibley in 1982. 2 years later, in 1984, Alice Walker was honored for The Color Purple. On that night of the party, someone asked the question, "Who do you think will win it this year?" Pat said, "Phil Williams." I added, "Without question." Someone else said, "No competition." Another said, "It's a lock." No one disagreed, and we were right. It was a lock. Phil did receive the third Townsend Award for it. The It was his novel, The Heart of a Distant Forest, a tender and poetic story of a man's rediscovered life on his journey into death. I've always believed if Phil had never published again, this book would secure his place as a major figure in Georgia's literary history. Thankfully, though, Heart of a Distant Forest was not his only novel or published work. For the record, here's the list. In fiction, The Heart of a Distant Forest, All the Western Stars, The Song of Daniel, Slow Dance in Autumn, Perfect Timing, Final Heat, Blue Crystal, The True and Authentic History of Jenny Dorset, A Distant Flame, The Campfire Boys. In nonfiction, The Silent Stars Go By, Crossing Wildcat Ridge, In the Morning, Reflections from First Light. In poetry, Elegies for the Water, and a chapbook, A Gift from Booney, Seymour, and Dog. It's my very favorite title of all of them, Phil. Both The Campfire Boys and Elegies for the Water were nominated by Mercer University Press for the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award. I will also tell you that on September 1 this year, Phil's epic poem, The Flower Seeker, will be released by Mercer University Press, a nearly 400-page manuscript about the 18th century naturalist William Bartram. The Flower Seeker is being deservedly touted as the literary event in the state for this year. You will hear much about it over the coming months. In addition, he informed me this past week that University of Georgia Press will be reissuing A Distant Flame in trade paperback in spring 2011. All of this is impressive, but it's almost a drop in the bucket. Another claim that could have been made in Phil's website is this: Maniac at the Keys. Here are some of his unpublished works. A 1,500-page novel called The Divine Comics, inspired by Dante's Divine Comedy. Emerson's Brother, a short novel about Ralph Waldo Emerson's mentally disturbed brother. 2 comic novels, one called Sunrise Boulevard, the other titled Almost Light. A serious novel titled The Shape of Rain. Another epic poem called Psalms for the Earth, honoring the Psalms found in the Bible. a story of a UGA English instructor who finds a variant edition of Walden that sets her off on a journey to Oregon. The title is The Rose Last Theorem. It's Phil's current project, though he also expects to issue another volume of occasional poems in the near future. And this is only his writing. He is equally engaged with his music, and you will find on his website news of two recent symphonic compositions, Symphony No. 17, Tannenberg, and Symphony No. 18 for the Civil Rights Martyrs. Because of his standing as a writer, there might be a tendency to dismiss his music as a hobby. It would be a poor assumption. In fact, when Phil entered the University of Georgia, it was as a music major, and for good reason. He has been composing music since his teenage years, and if you think he's not serious about it, you should know that at present he has 18 symphonies to his credit. Want to listen? You can download the Holocaust Symphony, or his In the Morning, or his Civil War music, or his Echoes of Asia, or his Earth music. It's all there under the code http://www.philipleewilliams.com. But Phil is being inducted into the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame as a writer, not as a composer. And it is that talent that we're here to celebrate. Let me tell you what I think of Phil Williams as a writer. With respect to all the other honorees being recognized today, and to all those already inducted, we have no one more accomplished than Phil Williams in those fundamentally important requirements that elevate writing from the readable to the remarkable. Of course, you could accuse me of being a bit biased and I would be found guilty, but only to the degree that friends ought to applaud the success of friends. I would challenge that I have been writing long enough, more than 50 years now, to have learned a few things about the craft that only experience can teach. And from those years, from the typing of millions of words, I can tell you that the man we honor today, this Philip Lee Williams, is among the finest writers the state of Georgia has ever produced. The proof of it is in his work, in his variety of style and subject, written to a standard of literature that qualifies it as art. It is in his work ethic. Chickens complain about his early rising. The man is up at 3:45, writing by 4:15, and that is only the finger to the keys time. I do not believe his mind is ever at rest. It is in his intimidating intellect. He might toy with a flashing thought, that little jolt of creative energy we think of as the muse. But I promise you, when the words go to paper, Phil Williams has thought them through. I know of no one who is better at research. If Phil wrote that Sherman used flamethrowers and tanks and air support from Dobbins Air Force Base during his invasion of Atlanta, I would think that our historians and Margaret Mitchell missed a few important facts in their telling of that historic event. It is in his understanding and in his handling of language. He has the ear, not only for dialogue, but for the tricky, mesmerizing rhythms of narrative. It's the same as his hearing of music, clean, poetic, captivating, the almost perfect balance between the dreamer's wish and the workman's skill. And last, it is in his awareness of his role as a writer, that his characters are not a medium for him, but that he is a medium for his characters. He honors them for who they are, not who he wants them to be. And that is a great giving from any writer. I'm often asked to name writers I admire, discounting friends. And I offer such names as Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Wendell Berry, Fred Chappell, Kathy Heppenstall, many, many others. But I always violate the request. I always add Philip Lee Williams, who certainly is a friend. And it's not because I think Philip needs any public relations support from me. It's because For over 50 years, I have learned enough about writing to know when to stand in awe. Today, I stand in awe in presenting to you Philip Lee Williams, my brother in art, who brings dignity and great talent to our Hall of Fame. Thank you.
Well, hello, and thank you so much for letting me share a few minutes with you today. I know it's about time to eat, and we all want to get going. But if you'll just bear with me just a minute, I would be grateful. Before I begin my brief prepared remarks, there are a few people I do want to recognize as well, as Judith did, who I would not be here today in any sense without them. And I want to recognize my father-in-law, Fred Rowley, who is here today, who believed in me when very few others did, and who remembers me as when I was dating his daughter, who I've now been married to for 37 years, and sitting at his kitchen table early in the morning, scratching and writing and everything, and nobody had a clue what I was doing. But thank you so much for your support always. I want to recognize my father, Marshall Williams, who is here. He is the center and heart of our family, and it was from him and at his feet that I learned to love literature, music, and so many other things, along with my mother. Thank you for all you've done, and thank you for being here. I want to thank my kids, Brandon, who's here with his wife, Laura, and to say how proud I am of everything that you all do. And I want to recognize my daughter, Megan, who is the light of my life. And finally, I want to recognize my wife, Linda, who is the center of my life, the heart of everything that I have ever done, and without whom I would not be here at all, period. And it's just that simple. I have a lot of other family here. My brother and my sister are here, and I am just thrilled to be here. And I also I want to dedicate my time here today to my mother, who passed away in 2008. Her name was Ruth. And she was beautiful in any way you can think of that word. I stand before you today with humility that is as profound as it is deep. I keep asking myself, what am I, Phil Williams out of Madison, Georgia, doing in a Hall of Fame with Flannery O'Connor, Conrad Aiken, and Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr.? I have in my mind this picture of them sitting in a room welcoming me warmly while trying hard not to laugh. Flannery, no longer needing her crutches, walks over to me, shakes my hand, and says, I know Madison's just up the road from Milledgeville, a bird sanctuary, but I didn't have no idea that anyone there was capable of wasting as much time as I did. And yet I can't quite imagine having lived a life that would have given me a tenth the joy for 100 times the work. So if I don't quite feel I belong in the company of so many great writers, of the Kofers and the Kays, the Margaret Mitchells and the Alice Walkers, that doesn't mean I'm not thrilled to be invited to the party. In point of fact, this is one of the happiest days of my life. To be here surrounded by a family I love and friends who are so dear is the kind of thing about which we all dream, but which seldom happens in real life. Although I am in no sense allergic to money, the older I get, the more I know that it is the least valuable thing that we can leave to our children and grandchildren. Love, of course, is the first and best gift, but a close second is a life of the mind. I was among the most fortunate of kids to grow up in a family that didn't care especially about wealth, but cared passionately about Bach and Shakespeare, about Wordsworth and Beethoven, about poetry and science, music and visual art. On long car trips, my brother and sister and I would give our father and sometimes our mother a category, any category, and then we would get a question to which we were expected to know the answer. Of course, we cheated. I asked for questions in classical music about which I knew a lot, and Mark would ask for something in physics or chemistry, and Laura Jane, who would be the high school valedictorian, could ask questions on anything. And from that traveling quiz show, we all learned the answers to 1,000 different things. My father might ask me a question about the romantic poets, and as a coda, my mother would recite Leigh Hunt's Abu bin Adam, memorized 40 years before, without missing a word. I knew from the time I was 14 that I would live a life in the arts. I loved science and nature and sports, but I lived for the arts. For a long time, I wanted only to be a great composer, but by the time I was in my late teens, I began to realize that the art I would most often try to inhabit was literature. It wasn't hard to know why. When I read poetry, in many ways, I become and became the poem. It wasn't just blood and sinew to me. It was marrow. It was the stone on which I was meant to stand, if indeed I stood at all. I suppose my family was unusual in that my parents stressed a knowledge of and love of arts and sciences equally. From childhood, I loved science, but as it turned out, my gifts lay more in explaining science than in doing it. Albert Einstein once said, "The intuitive mind is a sacred gift, and the rational mind is a faithful servant." We have created a society that honors the servant and has forgotten the gift. Although I still doubt my own gifts in the presence of these great women and men, I do not for a minute doubt that I have lived largely with the intuitive mind and its grace and grandeur. As some of you may know, my family has been connected to the University of Georgia for more than 6 decades. I have marinated among some of the best and brightest men and women alive during all my years here. I also awoke one morning in Reed Hall when I was a freshman and saw a chicken walking down the hall. Maybe it is that eternal confrontation between the epic lunacy of the real world and the slopes of Parnassus that make a life of the mind such an unending joy. I can imagine very little that would give me more pleasure than knowing I will be in this magnificent Hall of Fame. For that and so much more, I want to say thank you to the University of Georgia and to the UGA libraries for this honor. Trying to explain what one does as a creative writer can often sound a little strange, I admit. Once, when my daughter Megan was very young, she came to me and said, "Let me get this straight. You make up one person," and she made a little hand puppet, sock puppet with her hand, like this, "and then you make up another person, and then you make them talk to each other?" And I had to admit that was pretty much what I did. And she looked at me very sadly and turned and walked off. Now that girl who didn't believe in such foolishness is already an accomplished artist too, and she has already exhibited her photographs at the High Museum of Art in Atlanta and will be a freshman at Agnes Scott College this fall. I'm equally proud of our son Brandon, who would have held his own in many different categories in our traveling quiz program, especially in Asian history, the focus of his degree at the University of Georgia. "There is no use in trying," said Alice after she'd gone down the rabbit hole. "One can't believe impossible things." "I dare say you haven't had much practice," said the Queen. "When I was your age, I always did it for half an hour a day. Why, sometimes I believed as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast." To this day, I believe in things some people find impossible even to consider. I believe that poetry matters. I believe that a life without art is intolerable. I believe that those who would destroy education, especially education in the arts and music, are guilty of crimes, and that people in the future will remember their names and hold them accountable. But mostly I believe in the power and necessity of writing. And needless to say, when I began as a writer, I only knew where the road lay, but I had no idea how to travel it. When I was in my early 20s, I wrote a novella that had to be one of the worst things committed to paper since the invention of movable type. My second work, a 600-page novel, was so bad that I pictured Johann Gutenberg slapping himself on the forehead with the most profound regret imaginable. At that point, I was publishing poetry with some regularity and could have given up on fiction. But I decided to make a list of everything that I loved in the world and to try to write about that. The manuscript was a quiet novel called The Heart of a Distant Forest. and I was off in a life that I could barely believe as it unraveled. Along the way, I have most often written about people at the margins of society, those out of the mainstream because of age or social position or race or beliefs. My last two novels, for example, have been about Southerners who are against the South's position in the Civil War. It hasn't been the easiest course. The Pulitzer Prize-winning writer Dave Barry put it most succinctly when he wrote, "The problem with writing about religion is that you run the risk of offending sincerely religious people, and then they come after you with machetes." No one has come after me with machetes, not yet. On the contrary, people have been more than wonderful to me and have treated me with respect and kindness that continually humbles me. And so I stand before you today deeply moved to be here. Mark Twain once said, "Grief can take care of itself, but to get the full value of joy, you must have somebody to divide it with." So today I want to share with all of you here the joy I feel, to divide it among us as readers and lovers of books. And if we listen closely enough to the sound of that inner grace and joy, it may well sound like Flannery O'Connor laughing, finally healed by what we are allowed to become, even when time has taken us away. Bless you all for being such wonderful partners in the joyous pilgrimage of this writer's life. Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks to all of you for being here and for your support of the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame and its programs. And let's give one more round of applause to our 2010 inductees into the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame. Thank you.